When a Jamaican says nyam, they're not just telling you to eat. They're speaking a word that traveled over 4,000 miles from the forests of Ghana. When they use unu for you all, they're echoing the voices of Igbo ancestors from southeastern Nigeria. When they pour libation or celebrate with drums, they're continuing traditions that survived the Middle Passage intact. This isn't just cultural borrowing. This is bloodline connection proven by DNA. Recent genetic studies reveal something extraordinary. Despite historical records showing that most enslaved people came from various regions of Africa, the maternal lineages of modern Jamaicans trace back overwhelmingly to two specific areas: the Akan people of Ghana's Gold Coast and the Igbo people of Nigeria's Bight of Biafra. We're talking about 59.7% Akan maternal heritage, with the Igbo representing the second largest ancestral group. But here's the remarkable part. These weren't just numbers on slave ships. These were sophisticated civilizations with advanced political systems, rich spiritual traditions, and military cultures that shaped empires. And when their people were torn from Africa, they didn't just survive in Jamaica, they rebuilt their world. If you want to understand the true story of African heritage in the Caribbean, not the simplified version you learned in school, but the deep, complex, beautiful reality, hit that subscribe button. What you're about to discover will completely transform how you see Jamaican culture. This documentary is based on peer-reviewed genetic studies, linguistic research, historical records, and archaeological evidence. While some cultural connections remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate, the DNA evidence for West African ancestry in Jamaica is scientifically robust. We present the most current academic consensus while acknowledging areas where research continues to evolve. In 2012, a groundbreaking study published in BMC Medicine shattered long-held assumptions about Jamaican ancestry. Researchers analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of nearly 400 Jamaicans, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, and made a stunning discovery. Despite the historical evidence that an overwhelming majority of slaves were sent from the Bight of Biafra and West Central Africa near the end of the British slave trade, the study revealed, the mtDNA haplogroup profile of modern Jamaicans show a greater affinity with groups found in the present-day Gold Coast region, Ghana. The numbers are striking. Using sophisticated genetic analysis, researchers calculated that 59.7% of Jamaica's maternal lineage traces back to the Gold Coast, primarily the Asante Akiem area of Ghana's Ashanti region. This means that if you're Jamaican, there's a better than even chance that your mother's 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 line reaches back to the Akan people of Ghana. But this finding posed a puzzle. Historical shipping records from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database show that the Bight of Biafra, the region encompassing southeastern Nigeria where the Igbo people lived, actually sent more enslaved people to Jamaica than any other region. So how do we reconcile the historical records with the genetic evidence? The answer reveals something profound about cultural survival and adaptation. The researchers propose what they call the cultural commonality hypothesis. Akan people who arrived in Jamaica, they argue, found the acclimatization and acculturation process less stressful because of cultural and linguistic commonalities, leading ultimately to a greater chance of survivorship and a greater number of progeny. What this means is devastating and beautiful at once. The Akan people who survived weren't just stronger individuals. They were part of cultural networks that helped each other adapt, survive, and build families. Their shared languages, spiritual practices, and social structures became survival mechanisms. But this doesn't diminish the Igbo contribution. Between 1775 and 1800 alone, over 68,000 enslaved people from the Igbo heartland of Bonny were transported to Jamaica. While they may not dominate the maternal genetic profile, their cultural impact was enormous. The survival of Igbo words in Jamaican patois, the retention of specific cultural practices, and the documented role of Igbo people in resistance movements all testify to their enduring influence. Modern genetic studies paint a complex picture of Jamaican ancestry: 80.3% sub-Saharan African ancestry, overall 10% European ancestry, 5.7% East Asian ancestry. Within the African component, 59.7% traces to Ghana's Gold Coast, primarily Akan. Significant Igbo genetic markers, especially in certain regions of Jamaica, smaller but notable contributions from Central Africa, Senegal, and other West African regions. This genetic diversity reflects the complexity of the slave trade itself. Jamaica received enslaved people from across Africa, but the Akan and Igbo formed the largest and most culturally influential groups. To understand Jamaica, we must first understand the Akan. Long before Europeans reached West Africa, the Akan people had built some of the most sophisticated societies on the continent. The Ashanti Empire, the largest and most powerful Akan state, controlled gold mines that fueled trade networks stretching from the Sahara to the Atlantic coast. The Akan weren't simply victims of the slave trade. They were initially its partners and rivals. Their advanced military technology, complex political systems, and economic networks made them formidable powers. The British called them Coromantes, after the coastal fort where many were imprisoned, and colonial records consistently describe them as warlike and exceptionally skilled in military matters. When Akan people were enslaved and transported to Jamaica, they brought more than just their bodies. They carried in their minds complete cultural systems, languages, spiritual practices, political concepts, and social structures that would fundamentally shape Jamaican society. Consider the evidence still visible today. Jamaican patois contains more Akan-derived words than any other African language. Nyam, to eat, duppy, ghost, se, say, that. And hundreds of other everyday words come directly from Twi and Fonte, the major Akan languages. But it goes deeper than vocabulary. Akan grammatical structures, tonal patterns, and even proverbs translated into English are woven throughout Jamaican speech. The Akan spiritual system, called Akam, survived in Jamaica as Kumfu and later evolved into Mayal and revival traditions. The Akan creator god Nyankopong was praised, though not directly worshipped, by enslaved people across Jamaica, regardless of their ethnic origins. The earth goddess Asaseya received libations, a practice still continued by Jamaica's Maroon communities today. The Akan matrilineal system, where royal succession passed through the female line, influenced Jamaican family structures and community leadership patterns. The concept of the Queen Mother, a powerful political figure who selected and could remove kings, can be seen in the strong tradition of female leadership in Jamaican communities. Perhaps most importantly, the Akan brought sophisticated concepts of resistance and military organization. The famous Jamaican Maroons, escaped slaves who fought the British to a standstill and won official recognition of their independence, organized themselves according to Akan military principles. Their legendary leader, Nanny of the Maroons, employed tactics and spiritual practices drawn directly from Akan traditions. Colonial documents reveal the profound impact of Akan military culture on Jamaica. The Coromantee Wars of the early 1700s saw enslaved Akan people organize multiple large-scale revolts using traditional military formations and leadership structures. These weren't desperate uprisings. They were carefully planned military campaigns led by people who understood warfare, politics, and organization. Tacky's Rebellion in 1760, led by an Akan chief, was the largest slave revolt in Jamaican history. Colonial administrator Edward Long wrote that Tacky and his forces were able to take over several plantations and kill the white plantation owners using sophisticated military tactics. The rebellion only ended when the British enlisted the help of Jamaican Maroons, who were themselves descendants of escaped Akan slaves, to defeat it. Olaudah Equiano, the famous 18th century author and abolitionist, described his Igbo homeland as a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. This wasn't romantic nostalgia. It was an accurate description of one of Africa's most culturally sophisticated societies. The Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria had developed unique social and political systems, unlike anything else in West Africa. Unlike the hierarchical kingdoms that dominated the region, traditional Igbo society was remarkably egalitarian and democratic. Decisions were made through elaborate consultation processes, leadership was earned rather than inherited, and individual achievement was highly valued. Between 1750 and 1807, hundreds of thousands of Igbo people were forcibly transported to Jamaica, making it the single largest destination for enslaved Igbo people in the Atlantic world. They came primarily through the ports of Bonny and Calabar, loaded onto British ships that carried them across the Middle Passage to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. The peak period of Igbo transportation occurred between 1790 and 1807, the final years of the British slave trade. This timing is crucial because it means that many Igbo people arrived in Jamaica when the plantation system was already established and dominated by earlier arrivals, particularly the Akan. Despite arriving later and in smaller family groups, Igbo cultural influence on Jamaica was profound and lasting. Igbo words embedded themselves deeply in Jamaican patois. Unu, the Igbo word for you plural, became standard Jamaican usage. Red Igbo described light-skinned people of mixed ancestry. The word obeya, Jamaica's traditional spiritual practice, may have Igbo roots, though this is debated among scholars. Igbo people were known for their fierce resistance to enslavement, but this resistance took a unique form. Rather than primarily organizing military revolts like the Akan, many Igbo people chose mass suicide, believing their spirits would return to their homeland. This practice became so common that it influenced popular culture. The 1791 anti-slavery poem Monimba depicted a pregnant Igbo woman committing suicide on a slave ship bound for Jamaica. The Jonkonu festivals that became central to Jamaican Christmas celebrations show strong Igbo influences. Igbo musical styles, particularly the Igbo songs preserved in Maroon communities, maintained distinctive rhythmic patterns and call-and-response structures that shaped the development of Jamaican music. While the Akan provided the dominant spiritual framework for Jamaica, Igbo religious concepts enriched and complicated that system. Igbo beliefs about ancestors, the relationship between the living and the dead, and the power of ritual merged with Akan practices to create uniquely Jamaican spiritual traditions. Olaudah Equiano's 1789 autobiography provides rare first-hand testimony about the Igbo experience in Jamaica. When he visited the island as a free man, he was specifically recruited by plantation owner Dr. Charles Irving to help manage enslaved Igbo people because of his linguistic abilities. Equiano wrote about hiring my own countrymen and serving as a cultural bridge between enslaved Igbo people and their captors. This reveals something important about Igbo cultural survival. While they might have been outnumbered by earlier arrivals, Igbo people maintained strong ethnic consciousness and mutual support networks. Plantation records describe enslaved Igbo people maintaining unwritten rules of the plantation that even slaveholders were forced to respect. Jamaican patois isn't simply English with a few African words mixed in. It's a complete linguistic system that reflects the complex cultural negotiations between African survivors and their new Caribbean reality. The depth of African influence goes far beyond vocabulary to include grammar, syntax, tonal patterns, and even ways of thinking about language itself. Akan languages, particularly Twi and Fante, form the deepest layer of African influence in Jamaican patois. This makes sense given the genetic evidence showing the dominance of Akan maternal lineages. Children learning to speak in the 18th century Jamaica were often raised by Akan-speaking women who passed down not just words but entire linguistic structures. Consider some everyday Jamaican expressions. Niam, to eat, comes directly from Akan, where it means exactly the same thing. Duppy, ghost, derives from the Twi word dupont, meaning cotton tree root. Because spirits were believed to inhabit tree roots, C works as a quotation marker. Him tell me C. Corresponding to an Akan word meaning, quote, as follows, Obia, comes from the Ashanti Twi word Obayi, meaning witchcraft. But the influence goes deeper than individual words. Jamaican patois uses reduplication, repeating words or syllables for emphasis, which is a characteristic feature of Akan and other West African languages, but not of English. Phrases like lickle lickle, very small, or walk walk, keep walking, follow African linguistic patterns. Despite their smaller genetic footprint, Igbo linguistic contributions to Jamaican patois are culturally significant and still widely used. Unu, U plural, is perhaps the most universally recognized Igbo contribution to Caribbean English. Red Igbo, light-skinned person, reflects Igbo concepts of skin color and identity. Various proverbs and expressions show Igbo structural influences. Musical terminology and spiritual vocabulary retain Igbo elements. The African influence on Jamaican patois extends to fundamental grammatical structures that distinguish it from English. Like many West African languages, Jamaican patois uses strings of verbs without conjunctions. Mitek book gi him. I took the book and gave it to him. This construction is completely natural in Akan and Igbo, but foreign to English. While Jamaican patois isn't fully tonal like its African ancestors, it retains melodic intonation patterns and uses pitch to convey meaning in ways that English does not. Jamaican patois, like Akan and Igbo, focuses more on whether an action is completed or ongoing rather than exactly when it occurred. The particle a indicates continuing action. Me ago, I am going. Perhaps nowhere is the African influence more evident than in Jamaica's rich tradition of proverbs. Many Jamaican sayings are direct translations from Akan wisdom traditions. Cockroach no business in a fowl fight. Don't get involved in other people's problems. Reflects Akan concepts of social boundaries. Every hoe have dem stick a bush. Everyone has their place in the world. Translates an Akan proverb about social order. Finger neighbor tell finger see him stink. People don't criticize those who are like themselves. Expresses an Akan understanding of group loyalty. What makes this linguistic legacy remarkable is its vitality. Jamaican patois isn't a museum piece. It's a living, evolving language spoken by millions of people across the Caribbean diaspora. From London to Toronto to New York, Jamaican communities maintain these African linguistic connections while continuing to adapt and change. Modern Jamaican artists, from Bob Marley to Sean Paul to Shenseea, carry these ancient African words and grammatical structures into global popular culture. When a Jamaican artist uses Niam or Duppy in a song, they're transmitting linguistic DNA that connects directly back to the Akan forests of Ghana. In 2019, Ghana declared a Year of Return, commemorating 400 years since the first documented enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. Thousands of African Americans and Caribbean people made pilgrimages to Ghana, many describing intense emotional connections to landscapes they'd never seen before. For Jamaicans, this wasn't just symbolism. The genetic evidence provided scientific validation for connections that had been maintained through centuries of cultural practice. When Jamaican visitors to Ghana hear Twi being spoken and recognize words from their childhood, when they see traditional Akan ceremonies that mirror Jamaican spiritual practices, when they encounter social structures that feel familiar, they're experiencing genetic memory made manifest. Modern diplomatic relations between Ghana and Jamaica reflect these deep historical connections. Both governments have established cultural exchange programs, educational partnerships, and trade agreements that acknowledge their shared heritage. Ghana's government has actively courted Caribbean investment and return migration, recognizing the diaspora as part of an extended Ghanaian family. Jamaican communities in Ghana and Ghanaian communities in Jamaica serve as living bridges between these cultures. These aren't new immigrant communities. They're the continuation of connections that were never fully severed. While Ghana gets more attention in popular discussions of African heritage, the Igbo connection to Jamaica remains culturally vital. Modern Igbo cultural centers in Jamaica maintain traditional festivals, language classes, and spiritual practices. Jamaican visitors to southeastern Nigeria often report the same sense of recognition and homecoming that others experience in Ghana. The digital age has strengthened these connections. Social media groups connect Jamaicans with Igbo and Akan people, sharing cultural practices, genealogical information, and mutual support. DNA testing has allowed thousands of Jamaicans to identify specific ethnic groups and even potential family connections in West Africa. This isn't a one-way relationship. Jamaican music, food, and cultural practices have found enthusiastic audiences in both Ghana and Nigeria. Reggae and dancehall music are enormously popular across West Africa, often seen as expressions of shared African identity. Jamaican patois phrases have entered the vocabulary of young West Africans, who see them as part of a global African cultural renaissance. What we're witnessing is the reconstruction of cultural networks that slavery tried to destroy. The Akan and Igbo people who were torn from Africa didn't just survive in Jamaica. They preserved, adapted, and transmitted essential elements of their civilizations to their descendants. Every time a Jamaican pours libation for ancestors, speaks patois, practices traditional healing, or organizes community resistance, they're channeling specific African cultural systems that can be traced back to particular ethnic groups in Ghana and Nigeria. The story of Jamaica's West African heritage is ultimately about survival, resistance, and cultural persistence against impossible odds. The Akan and Igbo people who were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic didn't just endure, they rebuilt their worlds, maintained their identities, and passed on their cultures to their descendants. The genetic evidence confirms what cultural anthropologists and linguists have long observed. Jamaica is not simply a Caribbean island with some African influences. It's a West African society that happens to be located in the Caribbean, shaped by specific ethnic groups with identifiable cultural practices and maintained through generations of conscious cultural transmission. When Jamaicans speak of Ghana as their motherland, or Nigeria as their ancestral home, they're not engaging in romantic Pan-Africanism. They're acknowledging scientifically documented genetic and cultural connections that link them to specific places, peoples, and traditions. This heritage isn't just historical curiosity, it's living culture that continues to shape Jamaican identity, influence global music and art, and provide spiritual and emotional sustenance to millions of people in the Caribbean diaspora. The chains of slavery were broken long ago, but the chains of culture, language, genetics, and spiritual connection, those chains were never broken at all. They were transformed, strengthened, and passed down as precious inheritance from generation to generation. Today, nearly 4 centuries after the first enslaved Akan person set foot on Jamaican soil, their descendants still say "Nyam" when they eat, still pour libation for their ancestors, and still carry in their genes the evidence of West African bloodlines that refused to be erased. That's not just survival, that's victory. This deep connection between Jamaica and West Africa challenges everything we think we know about the African diaspora. If this opened your eyes to the complexity and beauty of African heritage in the Caribbean, subscribe for more untold stories that reveal the truth about our interconnected history. Share this with someone who needs to understand the real story of African cultural survival. Because these connections aren't just history, they're family.